Just a minute, I get closer.
Are we ready? Hey,
Thank you.
well, welcome. And here we are to talk about Paul. As I brilliantly put it, the indispensable man. Pretty remarkable stuff. It's arguable, I suppose, but next to Jesus, the most important figure in Christianity, I think. In terms of what he accomplished, not only in terms of the breadth of what he encompassed in his ministry. If you think, not to make any ridiculous comparisons, but Jesus spent all of his time, and that time, at least as far as we know it in the scriptures, in the Gospels, probably 2.5 years or more in the modest little area known as Judea, a little bit of Samaria, and Galilee, and that's it. And now Paul is a world traveler by comparison. And also what Paul does with some of the ideas that are embedded in the reality, the words and deeds, and meaning of Jesus, which Paul will develop. And these are crucial for Christianity. So he's a very important figure. What I propose to do in this first class is to spend some time on, so to speak, Paul the man, and we'll spend a little time in terms of his life, such as we have it, which is in some respects much more personally revealing in terms of Paul tells us details about his life that Jesus never tells us about his. Jesus never really indicates what's it like or gives any indication of what's it like growing up in Nazareth, for instance. Not that Paul gives us a great deal of information about Tarsus, but there are some things that we can pull out about Tarsus and Paul and infer from his letters. Paul, as I will say later on, my father had a phrase, and I don't know how far this phrase has traveled in terms of common language. Paul wore his heart on his sleeve. And I would also say he wore his faith on his sleeve. He was not a shrinking violet. He was not just telling you stuff, he was telling you about himself. Jesus does. Jesus says, one of the essential commands of Jesus is follow me. Now, whether Paul does him one better or not, I'll leave that to your judgment. But Paul says, at least on one occasion, imitate me as I imitate Christ. So he is, no shrinking violet, and he's insisted. There are papers on the corner, sir, as you come in right there. Why don't you grab one each of those? Thank you. So there are things about him that are fascinating and intriguing. And again, however tall he was an astonishing giant of a person. So let us, what I usually do in beginning a class is at each class we'll have a prayer. And this is not so much a prayer as it is a kind of a detail of Paul summarizing his experience as a missionary. And just get a sense of this, and then we'll pause for just a moment to consider, now, why in heaven's name did he do all this stuff? You know, again, this is not Club Med. I mean, the kinds of things that Paul talks about as his lot. He begins rather bluntly in the 1 Corinthians letter, chapter 11, verses 23 to 29. Often near death, 5 times I have received lashes from the Jews. 3 times I have been beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I have been shipwrecked. A night and a day I passed in the watery deep. On frequent journeys, in dangers from rivers, dangers from bandits, in dangers from my own kind, in dangers from Gentiles, in dangers in the cities, in dangers in the wilderness, in dangers on the sea, in dangers from false brethren. Doesn't seem to have too many friends. In toil and in hardship, many times without sleep, in hunger and thirst, many times not eating, cold and not clothed. Besides other things, there is on me the daily pressure constituted by anxiety for the churches. Who is weak, and I am not weak? Who is made to stumble into sin, and I am not indignant? Then Raymond Brown, who is arguably the great Catholic biblical scholar of the 20th century, who died all too young at the age of 70, just after he retired from Union Seminary as a professor. Union Theological Seminary in New York, which is a Protestant seminary, very prestigious place. Brown says this: imagine this character trudging his way mostly by foot, a Jew with a knapsack on his back, coming upon the grandeur and power of the Greco-Roman world, in cities such as Ephesus and Athens, and late in life, Rome itself. He was set to challenge all that grandeur and power in the name of a crucified criminal before whom he proclaimed, every knee in heaven, upon the earth, and under the earth had to bend. The contempt and mockery of many Gentiles before this rag picker of ideas rings true as it's reported in the book of Acts. Well, why did he do all this stuff? He says in Philippians, I count everything as loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus, my Lord. And in Galatians he says, the Son of God loved me and gave himself up for me. For me. Not just for you. For me. It's very personal. Finally, in 2 Corinthians, he will say, the transcendent power comes from God, not from us. We are afflicted in every way possible, but we are not crushed. We have our doubts, but never despair. We are persecuted, but never forsaken. We are struck down, but we are never annihilated. So there. It's rather remarkable fellow. Let me just take a minute to maybe just to say, have people say hello to one another. Some of you I recognize from times of yore, but perhaps this is the first time you've been, or at least that we've been together, and so maybe just take a moment to say hello and to introduce yourselves. My name is, I'm going to not move too much. My name is Bernard Campbell. I'm a Paulist priest. I've been here since the beginning of December. Previous life, I've spent about 35 years in campus ministry at places like UC San Diego, UC Berkeley, MIT, University of Texas, and the University of Clemson. I think that's it. I lived for 3.5 years, but mostly I lived out of a suitcase, somewhat like Paul, doing missions in the upper Midwest, but I lived in Minneapolis in the little place called Dinkytown, if anybody knows it. It's where the University of Minnesota is, and so on. So, no, I know something of the university world, having spent a lifetime in it, or around it, and through it, and so on. But please, I come from New York City. I don't have an accent. But why don't we just introduce ourselves? So why don't we get over here?
I'm Marlene Fabro.
I'm Janet Baumgartner.
And I'm Pat Bloom.
I'm Chuck Bloom. I was born in Grand Rapids and I've lived here for 79 years.
Wow, way to go.
We're lovers.
Good for you.
We've been married
Oh.
a long, long time.
We met at Union High School,
Wow. Okay. How long have you been married?
58 years.
Congratulations. Way to go.
Karen Wassick, and we live near Grand Haven, so our home church is St. Anthony.
Okay.
I'm Bob Wasick.
I'm Marge Kozakowski.
My name's Raul Gonzalez. I'm from Saginaw, but I live here now.
Okay. Tell me where Saginaw is. I have a rough.
East side of Michigan,
It's in the.
near north of Flint, Pontiac, and Detroit.
Yeah.
Up near the thumb, yeah. Near Big
Okay.
City.
Okay. Saginaw was a diocese, isn't it?
Yes.
Is
Yes.
it?
Yes.
Was Saginaw where? What was his name?
Hunter.
Bishop
Hunter.
Hunter.
Yes.
Yeah.
He lived there. He was a remarkable man.
Absolutely.
I had the wonderful opportunity to spend a day with him once. He's just a remarkable gentleman and brilliant fellow, and he wrote very well. He's just a remarkable man. So anyway,
Played hockey too, didn't he?
he did with that, and he beat the pants off the younger kids. You know, he'd take on the younger priests, and boy, he would be tough.
He had a bad leg or bad foot.
Well, no, he had cancer, so he had a prosthetic leg, and as I think that came off when he was a child, so he got used to it. I didn't notice, I didn't limp or anything when I was with him for the day, but anyway. Well, why don't you introduce yourself?
I'm Judy Matei. I'm glad to be here.
Hi. You were gonna say,
Yeah, your microphone is, I think, is hitting your shirt.
oh, is that what it is?
Yeah.
Oh, and there it goes, there goes the, one over here. I think pardon my moving out of camera range, but get this up here. This little thingamadoo here. Does it go like this? I guess it does. Well, let's see if that works. Well, want to do something of a sketch of St. Paul's life, and I'll have opportunity to talk about this perhaps again even, that well, let me go through the something of Paul and kind of some general overall observations. Then I'll move into themes of Paul and so on. Of course, we know of Paul as Saul, okay, and the one. At the age of 73, I learned something new, which is nice, even about St. Paul. Both Father Brown and Father Fitzmyer, who's a Jesuit, I don't know if he's still alive, but he would be up there in years now himself, a really old guy. And Fitzmyer is a very excellent scholar as well. Both highly esteemed Catholic scholars, not only within the Catholic community, but also within the both ecumenical community and also the Jewish community. Father Brown was beloved by Jews for much of his writing about Jesus, interestingly enough. And his care about Jesus, first of all, Jesus as a Jew, and then also his care around some particularly knotty issues, for instance, the trial of Jesus. Jews want to say, oh, this is all a plant of the Christians and so on. It has nothing to do with Judaism. But anyway, Brown is very, very good, and so is Fitzmyer. Well, both Ray Brown and Joe Fitzmyer speak of Saul, Paul of Tarsus, surely as being one of the most important figures in the history of Western civilization. We know of him through his letters, written both to individuals and to churches. By and large, churches that he established in his travels through the eastern and northern Mediterranean basin in the middle 3 decades, roughly the 40s, the 50s, and perhaps how much of the 60s is hard to fathom. But certainly in the 40s and the 50s and perhaps early 60s of the first century of what we call our common era. He has a prominent place to play in Luke's second volume, the Acts of the Apostles, which I mention up here on the board, where Peter holds center stage in the early chapters, and Paul holds the focus for the last, roughly 60% of the book of Acts. There are some inconsistencies between Paul's letters and what Luke says about Paul. Generally, the wisdom has been to trust what Paul says in his letters, particularly about himself. And to largely discount what Luke says. There's been some slight revision of that in terms of don't completely discount Luke. That Luke, of course, has certain editorial concerns that he's interested in. There are details about Paul's life that he passes over in silence. One of the, which Paul does not pass over in silence, that one of the characteristics of Luke in his writing, both in the Gospel and in the Acts of the Apostles, Luke is both the most gifted of the New Testament writers, most gifted in terms of literary writing, and also in terms of the larger sense of how he arranges things and orders things. And Luke is very interested, as he says to the receiver of both volumes, the Gospel and the Acts of the Apostles, a certain Theophilus, of whom we know nothing. He says to him that I am providing you with an orderly account, one of Jesus' life, and in the second volume, an orderly account of how things went after Jesus died and rose and ascended into heaven. Now, an orderly account for Luke is one which may be something of our bias in terms of how we read things or how we take things in. Now, people may use different orders, but we are familiar with one predominant order in 21st century writing and the way we think. And that order is the order of time. So whenever we're reading about someone, well, we go back to the beginning. You know, Johnny was born in such and such a day, the parents were, he had brothers and sisters and so on. And then we take it however much detail, but we take it, you know, grade school, all the way through. Well, Luke's order is not chronological. It's, if you will, spatial. He will say in the second volume in the Acts of the Apostles how things went from the time in Judea and then the time in Samaria. Yes, the time in Judea, the time in Samaria, and then in Galilee to the ends of the earth. So it's a kind of concentric circle model. So he will treat everything around Judea, first of all. And then he moves it out a little bit to Samaria. And then he'll move it out a little bit further. And then poof. And that poof is largely Paul, who serves as the carrier of the order, if you will. Peter is the carrier of the order in Judea, in Samaria, and in Galilee. And then Peter kind of steps off the stage, so to speak, while Paul comes on. Paul's first appearance is a kind of cameo. It's like whoever it was, the great stars. I was watching, I caught the beginning of an old movie the other night in which Humphrey Bogart plays a kind of a minor role. You know, we always think of Humphrey Bogart as a star, you know, but he had to start somewhere. And he starts, not quite in the background, off to the side a bit. He's not the first character. And Paul, Saul, starts off in a wordless, so to speak, cameo appearance in Jerusalem, holding the cloaks of everybody else who's stoning Stephen to death. And that's the appearance. It's just Paul just kind of sketches it. Luke just sketches it. Paul doesn't get anything to say at that point. And Saul held their cloaks. Boom. And then the next line is not about Saul. You have to wait a little while, then he makes his appearance when he goes off to Damascus. We'll get to that in a bit. And one of the other inconsistencies in Luke is, I want to be careful here, it's maybe I'm way over the top in saying this, and of course there are many nuances that I'm bypassing. Luke is a marvelous headline writer. He doesn't get into a lot of details, but he gives you a grand scope of things, whatever he's writing about. Either in terms of the story of Jesus or the story of the emerging church. One of the things that Luke is reluctant to get into is any dark corners. One of the famous phrases in the first few chapters of Luke is, and the community gained in wisdom and knowledge, and thousands joined the community this day, and thousands more joined the, you know, God, it's booming, you know, and that's the impression that Paul wants to give to Theophilus. That things are going well. You know, boom, 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 boom. And in fact, he's showing also a characteristic of this community, namely that they held everything in common. And he mentions a certain Benjamin who sells his property and brings it to the apostles and lays, not the property, but the filthy lucre, if you will, the dough, the check, whatever it might be, at the feet of the apostles. Literally, whatever. But, and you get the impression that everything is hunky-dory, you know, and it's just, they're all a bunch of saints. And Luke wants to give that impression, though he's stuck with a couple of characters, Sapphira, and I forget who the gentleman is, her husband, who cheat. And they don't turn everything in. So they get zapped in one passage. But generally speaking, Luke provides its kind of morning in America, so to quote somebody. This is the Lucan view of things. Luke, for instance, will not mention in his account of the growth of the church and Paul's leadership in this, he will not mention any of the problems that Paul is, all this shipwrecks and all. Well, he does mention the shipwrecks. We do hear about that there. But he doesn't mention any of the personal strife with the Corinthians, for instance, or the Galatians. Certainly not with Peter, with whom Paul has a serious problem, which we'll get to in a bit. He kind of bypasses all. He just... So we read, to construct something of the life of Paul, we go to the letters as the primary source, and the Acts of the Apostles is used as a backup and critically looked at. And to be careful, too, that Paul, who I love dearly, does have, he wasn't Irish, but he has an occasional moment where he is probably overstating the case. It's slightly overdone. And there are places we'll see when we hopefully I'll give you some little reading to do over the next 2 weeks from the letters. We'll see Paul can be very angry. And when he's angry, as with any of us, you could almost hear, it doesn't have to be a therapist, but it could be, some kindly soul next to you saying, now, dear, do you think you really want to say that? Whether Paul had anybody near him saying, dear, do you really want to say that? He probably didn't listen anyway. He just wrote, I'm going to get these people. So Paul's pretty angry in Galatians. We don't hear any of that in the Acts of the Apostles. So in any event, but Luke does provide important information about this, which is the central event of Paul's life, which we call, misleadingly call, although not, but it depends how we understand the word, the conversion of St. Paul. We have a feast day, January 25th, the conversion of St. Paul. It's the major feast day for the Paulist Fathers, our patron, St. Paul, and so on. But Paul himself refers to the event, but doesn't give us anything of a description. Luke gives us 3 descriptions of the same event. They're more or less the same. There are some details that change, and people will write master's theses, probably, or maybe even a doctoral thesis on the differences in the 3 different renderings of this event in Acts, and I think it's in chapter 9, and then again in chapter maybe 22, and then maybe in chapter 26. The last is done, I think, before Festus in Caesarea Maritima. We'll get to that in this overview. As Luke has Paul explain but it's Luke writing. So there are some important notes there in that conversion experience. At one time or another in the various translations and editions of the New Testament, Paul has been listed as the author of 14 letters. Curiously, there are no books in the Old Testament that correspond with this letter form. So it's a unique venture. The first letter, in fact, well, we could say this with a fair degree of confidence, that the first 7 here letters of Paul are really the first written documents that we have in the New Testament. They all come before the Gospel of Mark. Okay? So they're circulated to the churches, they're circulated widely, and later on they are included in what has become known as the New Testament. For Paul, of course, the Bible, as for Jesus, the Bible was the Hebrew Bible, and particularly for Paul, the Hebrew Bible was not limited to the Hebrew text. Paul also quotes extensively from what's called the Septuagint, S-E-P-T, I should have written it down, U-A-G-I-N-T, Septuagint. It means a group of 70. The legend has it that 70 Christian monks got together, or maybe it was 70 rabbis, I'm not sure. I think it was 70 rabbis because it's before the Christian era. In Alexandria, get together to translate the Hebrew Bible into Greek. And they each do the complete translation, writing out Genesis, Exodus, etc., Kings, and or Chronicles, and Prophets, and so Job, and so on and so forth. And they each, and they're all the same. That's the great legend. But this becomes known as the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. The Roman Catholic Church has always accepted both the Septuagint and the Hebrew text. The Septuagint has a few extra books in it, which Protestants did not see as being part of the Bible, but that's not an issue these days. That used to be a big issue. We used to bang each other over the head about my Bible is better than your Bible, and so on. But nevertheless, Paul certainly uses the Septuagint as a primary reference when he's quoting. He doesn't, go like this, Genesis chapter 15. He doesn't go to the text and quote it literally. He's quoting it from memory. So we'll see, there's a kind of looseness in the translation. Heavens forbid, some professor would give him a big X, for not footnoting properly, and Paul would say, to you. But any event, of the 14 letters that were attributed to St. Paul, contemporary scholars list 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, Romans, 1 and 2 Corinthians, Philippians, and Philemon as definitely being written by Paul. The letters to, the next column, the letters to the Ephesians, Colossians, and 2 Thessalonians. It is the majority opinion that these are more likely written by a disciple of Paul. Now, Paul may have known of these letters and actually have looked over them. We don't know that. But that distinction is made, that it is what's called the Deutero-Pauline letters. And then there is a collection of letters that were once attributed to Paul, called what's called the Catholic epistles, letters to Titus and 1st and 2nd Timothy. These letters focus not entirely, but though Timothy and Titus are both mentioned by Paul, Timothy more prominently is a colleague of Paul's, running back and forth to Corinth when Paul is in Ephesus. He sends Timothy off here and there. Pardon me. But Titus and Timothy are looked upon as letters that are focused on issues that are more likely of late first century concern, and hence probably could not have been written by Paul, who is dead no later than 67 AD. But maybe a bit earlier. We don't know for an absolute fact. And then finally, the last letter, Hebrews, almost everyone says was not written by Paul. Though it's attributed to Paul, which was a typical thing done by not only sacred writers, but secular writers too, who wanted to gain some authority for their text. They would say it was written by Homer, or it was written by whatever, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's a kind of a conceit, if you will, that was accepted largely. It doesn't discredit Hebrews as a accepted text in the New Testament, but it's probably not written by St. Paul. So there are at least 7 letters that are indeed focused on by Paul. Paul has been praised and blamed for many things. In the second letter of Peter, the author there, and interestingly, the second letter of Peter, which may be the last book, the last thing written in the New Testament, about 125 AD perhaps. And clearly Peter couldn't have written this because Peter was not around by then. But the author remarks that Paul's writings are difficult to understand. He has a little reference there. And goes on to say that there's plenty of opportunity for some people to twist Paul's meanings, etc., etc. Some have felt that Paul really railroaded Christianity, translating and applying Christian meaning in ways in which the peasant fishermen of Galilee would never have comprehended. And there may be some truth to that, if not the railroading part. At least there clearly is, obviously there is a lot of tension between the Galilean Jewish community, and particularly the community of Christians around James in Jerusalem, who are at some odds with Paul. They think Paul is going too far. He's not respecting enough the ancient traditions, etc. We'll get to these questions in more detail as we look at Galatians and as we look at the great monumental work of Romans in our third week. There are particular sensitivities among Jews with regard to Paul, and many equally sensitive very recently. And this is a sign of the ecumenical and interreligious thawing, Thawing, that comes about through Vatican Council II, and a greater degree of cooperation amongst both scholars, churches, and people, Jewish and Christian, and Christians, Protestant and Catholic, and Orthodox, to remember that group, which makes up an important dimension of Christianity. There has been a considerable thawing, and particularly in this case with many sensitive Jewish scholarly understandings of Paul that speak of Paul as their brother. It's a very touching note. Not just the great, what they call the revisionist, or the one who really started Christianity. Jesus did. Jesus was a good Jew. Paul is a bad Jew. That was something of an argument that was made for a long, long time, but it no longer holds. Many will find, and we'll also look at this when we get into Corinthians and other places, many will find that, claim that they read certain passages, particularly in 1 Corinthians, where Paul seems to be a misogynist. He's anti-women. And I often point out to people that if Paul is anti-woman, it is absolutely amazing in his letters how many women are around him. And not just around him, flitting here and there, but people, women who are around him, whom he relies upon, not just for cooking the meal, so to speak, or cleaning up afterwards, all that stuff, but really for being leaders in the Christian community. He will identify any number of them as his co-workers. So Paul has an extraordinarily positive relationship with a goodly number of women. One of the things that I may mention again when we get to it in Romans, but it's always fun to bring it up even here. If when Paul writes his letter to the Romans, it's the one community that he did not found. Corinth, Thessalonica, Philippi, etc., Galatians were all founded by Paul, the churches, and Philippians as well. But Rome is founded by, it has a reality on its own already. And Priscilla and Aquila are important people in that community who come over to Corinth, where they meet Paul for the first time. They come over to Corinth when and this is historically accurate, when the emperor Claudius, at a certain point, throws the Jews out of Rome, which is probably in the late in the late 40s, meaning 40 AD, 48, 49, 40, somewhere in there. Many of them had to leave Rome, and Prisca or Priscilla and Aquila come to Corinth, and that's where they befriend Paul. And I think, among other things, Prisca and Aquila are fellow tent makers. Maybe they started a union together, who knows. But Paul works with them, and they are his great friends, and they go on with him then to Ephesus. And then I think they may be back in Rome at a subsequent point after Claudius either relents of his anger towards the Jews or lets them back into Rome. Perhaps also I should, I'm going somewhat here and there, but just as a further point, just to locate things, in the Roman Empire, the Romans were a pretty tough crowd, and tolerated barely the various religious traditions that were all over the place, Cleopatra, etc., etc. They tolerated most things, but they were pretty darn serious about, eventually, as we come into the world of the emperor, they become very, very serious about the divinity of the emperor. Maybe there's a certain tongue-in-cheekness for some, but it's on their coins. The coins which Jews have. And when Jews go to the temple to get for the sacrifice, they have to pay. And what they have to do is the money changers and the money changers are people who take, Jews who take the Roman coin, which has the divine Caesar on one side. They take that, and then they give them a Hebrew coin. And it's the Hebrew coin then that becomes the coin of the realm to get the lamb or to get the pigeons or whatever it might be. But these things are all over the place. Now, Jews, over time, exactly how this transpires, I'm not certain, but Jews, particularly at the time of Jesus and after Jesus, certainly at the time of Claudius and Nero and so on, Jews have a special relationship, if you will. It's like the British and the Americans, a special relationship with the Romans, in that they're bracketed out from other religions. They're just not other religions. There are other religions, all of them. Then there's the Roman worship of the emperor, and then there's Jews. And they respect the Jewish religion. Now, whether that meant exemptions from worshiping the emperor or something else, I presume that was part of it, but I don't know for a fact. Jews were able to be citizens of Rome, which becomes a very important issue for Paul, because he is, through his family, a citizen of Rome. All right? Whether he voted or not, who knows? But nevertheless, he is a citizen, and this is a very, very crucial moment in his, when he, as they're about to belt him with rods for he says he was beaten 3 times with rods. Maybe it was the 4th time when he's in prison in Jerusalem, and they're going to beat him with rods. He informs the centurion who's about to belt him. He says, "Oh, by the way, I'm a Roman citizen." Whoops! The rods come down. "Oh, hey, jailer, we got to change the circumstances here." And so this is a very important thing. Now, Jews were somewhat protected within the Roman org. And interestingly enough, at first, of course, Romans looking at the Jews, they said, well, that's the Jews, you know. And we pick it up in both the New Testament with Pilate to some extent, and also in the Acts of the Apostles. There are any number of references to Roman authorities in Jerusalem, in Corinth, Gallio, etc., saying, when Paul is presented, he says, "Oh no, not another Jewish problem." He says, "This is theology. We don't have a major in theology in the Roman world. We have our laws, and this falls outside all of the stuff." So they have a tendency to push it away. They don't want anything to do with it, unless it gets tough. And what happened with the Jews and this emerging group coming out of the Jewish community, the Christian world, a Jewish Christian and increasingly Gentile Christian world, at least for a couple of decades, which is Paul's time, the emerging Christian world is understood in secular terms by Rome as largely a Jewish phenomenon. And there begin to be ruptures around the edges. And they are aware of the fact that the leader of the Christian group, a certain, as Tacitus puts it later on, an historian puts it, Chrestus, they call it, not Christus, but Chrestus, E-S-T-U-S. A certain Chrestus was killed by Pontius Pilate as an insurrectionist, and so on. So there's a little, whoops, wait a minute, here we got a bit of a problem here. And the Christians then start to be, and then you eventually have, the real critical time is after 70 AD, which is Paul is dead, Peter is dead. You have the separation, finally, of Jews and Christians. In the period from the death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus, roughly 30 AD, until 70 AD, maybe exceptions to this, but that 40-year period, Christians were considered Jews by the Romans. And Christians themselves, be they Jewish Christians or Gentile Christians, and increasingly they were Gentile Christians, still considered themselves part of the Jewish heritage. And it's only after 70 that the Damoclean sword comes in, and that's when you get the separation. And so you'll see in Jewish rabbinical sources, late first century, you will see anyone who is a follower of Jesus, who is Jewish, is excommunicated from the Jewish community. Their chair is turned around at the Passover dinner. They are not part of our community anymore. And Christians are doing like things to the Jews. So that's when the family feud really moves into high gear. Okay? Yeah.
Just a question, would that be called the beginning of what's called today shunning? You know, they don't do that or excommunication?
Well,
Protestants
Paul will talk
do-
about excommunication
Yeah.
also. It's earlier.
Catholics do excommunication, but Protestants do shunning. And
Oh,
and
I
was
see,
just-
I see.
Okay, and I was just wondering that I've never heard that, turning the chair around. That's very. I love that optic.
Yes,
And,
yes.
And I don't know. Just a thought.
Well, it's the beginning of well, this is a family feud, and sometimes family feuds are often a heck of a lot worse than international feuds. You know, the Japanese and the Americans could get over it. You know, the Christians in Ireland seemingly could not for centuries, et cetera, et cetera. But in any event, there are some, the shunning is, of course you had that marvelous example in Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter. And the young woman is in effect shunned. I would see that as in the Protestant tradition to be more of the congregational model. And this has impact in terms of Paul. It takes a little bit of time to explain, but briefly speaking, the shunning model has enormous power within the sense of a local congregation that, you know, I gave missions years ago for 3 years. First year I was tired in February, second year I was tired in October, third year I was tired in September when I started, and I said, I gotta get out of this thing. Because it was just, not quite 24/7, but when you're on, and I was on a lot. I was younger then, I could be on. But, oh gosh, I've been wiped out. But one place that my colleague and I went to, you may know of this, it's in the Fox River Valley. It's a town called Little Chute. Now, it may have changed a lot. It's near Kokona, Appleton. It's south of Green Bay. Little Chute at the time, well, Wisconsin, yes. It was little, heavens. But it's all part of the paper mill stuff and so on in that area. One of the forms of shunning took place when Catholics started to move into the world, the labor world around the paper mills on the Fox River, just by Appleton. And in Appleton itself, well, just above Appleton, there were two towns. One was called Neenah, Neneanah. Neenah was next to Beverly Hills, the second per capita wealthiest city in the country.
Then,
All right.
okay.
Well, you see all the manhole covers around, made in Neenah. I mean, there were any number of businesses there. Now, all the corporate officers lived in Neenah, and by and large, they were Protestant. Now, the town right next to it, I mean, a street, you know, the stoplight was the difference. There may have been a little rivulet in there. I think I went over a bridge or whatever. And that was Menasha. Menasha was the Catholic town. And as I remember vividly, St. Patrick's was the Polish parish. I found that rather interesting. And they were about 3 blocks separate, the Polish parish, the German parish, and the Irish parish. You know, and I worked in all 3 of these places. But eventually, because of the GI Bill of Rights, which is the great Emancipation Proclamation for Catholics in the United States, much more so than anything the American bishops ever did, forget it. This was Harry Truman and the Congress. Catholics got a step up in terms of education after the Second World War, and quickly as a result of that, the Catholic world was transformed. We now had, within a generation, an educated Catholic community, which was hard for the clergy to deal with, and has remained so many years later. Anyway, don't tell me, I know. Anyway, but this world of Catholics moving into corporate positions eventually had its consequence in terms of building a Catholic church in Neenah, which the Protestants were infuriated about and did everything to prevent the sale of property. Okay? But they had the last word in a certain sense. The Catholics, St. Gabriel's, and I gave a mission there. And by the time I got there, things were very, very different. But the old shunning and issues were there. The rectory of St. Gabriel's had the post office. The number on the rectory was 666. And it was out of total sequence. You know, and it was, yeah, we're going to get those Catholics somehow or other. So anyway, so there's an example of the shunning. In Little Chute, you had the internal shunning of the Catholics. Little Chute was a town of 5,000 people. Little Chute, it was just up the road from Neenah Menasha. I did all of these parishes in the Foxwood and Kokona with the cheese and everything else. And I loved it. I loved the people very much. And in Little Chute, the town was 5,000 Catholics, 5,000 people. All but about 5 or 6 of them were Catholics. So 4,994 of them were Catholics. Now, the phone book, they didn't even have a phone book. The phone book was the parish directory. Now, to make matters even more complicated, to say how little it was, if there were 4,994 Catholics in the town, 4,993 of them were Dutch. And they were all related. So the phone book, you know, you'd have the A's, B's, C, D. Well, the V's took up about 6 pages, you know, Van der Heuvels, Van der Hevels, anyway. The serpent finally came into Little Chute just prior to my coming. It wasn't me, but I didn't help. I did help matters a bit, I think. Wisconsin has a state law that every town has to have a public school. Well, this community held out against the public school because we had a Catholic grade school and Catholic high school here, perfectly fine. And the heck with those Protestants. Well, they started a public school in Little Chute. and some of the teachers were Catholics. And some of the parents, for whatever reasons, decided to send their children not to St. Francis or whatever the parish was, but to the public school. Well, yeah, I remember the fellow who was a barber sent his kids to the public school. Nobody would get a haircut from this guy. Now, when I was there on the missions, I got 3 haircuts in 3 weeks. And this guy kept going back to to give him a little business, for God's sakes, the poor guy who's struggling. And there were certain store owners, if you said, that was the shunning. So Catholics, by God, we knew how to do it too. As our secular friends down the days, and we see this in, among other things, the Federalist Papers in the late 18th century, religion in America gets lots of, well, it may be getting less these days, but it certainly has gotten through much of its history, particularly because of the Protestant majority, received all kinds of warm praise. Certainly for Christianity, and then Judaism too got in there. Islam that's a work in progress still, but and Catholics kind of got in eventually, but much opposed and so on. But for the Protestant world, this adulation or pious words, etc., did not translate into becoming the government, for instance. We see in the Federalist Papers with Hamilton and Madison, and I think Jefferson is the third one that writes part of that they do focus on religion as a sectarian reality. And they understand religion as tearing the commonweal. And so you want to keep the religions separate from each other. We don't want them to get together. Because if they get together, they're going to cause havoc. That's the working model. And it's amazing how that imagery endures through the centuries. And but a lot of it goes back to some of these terrible, and it goes back to, but is revealed in some of these terrible practices. Look how these Christians deal with each other in Little Shoot, let alone 666, let alone half a million other things. We could all find them. Anyway, but it's a good point you make. And I'll say a bit about excommunication later on with Paul. What does he mean by it, and so on. Some beginning facts about Paul. First of all, his name, and this comes from Fitzmyer and Brown. Saul rather, had the name Paul as well. In the Acts of the Apostles, in chapter 13, verse 9, Luke does a very neat thing. He has the name of Saul changed to Paul, and that's probably what we all remember as Abram becomes Abraham, and Simon becomes Peter, etc., etc., etc. So Saul became Paul. Well, Brown and Fitzmyer say that's probably not true. That most diaspora, which means outside of Israel, in Paul's lifetime, the diaspora Jews probably had 2 names. One was Saul, and Saul, the king of Israel before David, was, among other things, a Benjaminite, which Paul is, of the tribe of Benjamin. So he has properly the name Saul for his Jewish community in Tarsus, but he also has the name Paul, Paulus, which is a very common name throughout the Greco-Roman world. So he probably has 2 names, and he wasn't upset about. He didn't have crises, or, psychic troubles or whatever. So there was, probably from the very first, he has two names. He was born in Tarsus in Cilicia, and on the map, you can see where, let me see if I can find, if you, let's see, what's a convenient spot for you? Can you find Tarsus? Do you see Antioch? If you go up the Mediterranean coast to just where the Mediterranean kind of the northeastern corner of the Mediterranean, Antioch, and if you go at about 10 or 10:30 to the west, is this town of Tarsus right there, okay? Now, if you hold a finger on Tarsus and you go over to Athens, you see, I don't know how far it is, maybe 1,000 miles. That's a lot of miles. They didn't have planes in those days and so on. So people didn't, well, some did, but what happens in the 1st century BC, the Greeks and the Athenians, who are a continuing intellectual community, a very cultured world. Rome is a business place. Rome is the world of engineering and law degrees and so on. The world of Greece is the world of science, of philosophy, of math, and all of that. And so all the Roman kids are sent to Greece to learn, that's the Harvard or whatever it is of its day, or a university. I'll get in trouble if I go on too much about this. But what happens in the 1st century is that Athens begins to think that it's a little bit bigger than it is. And so they start pushing north on the Thracians. And the Thracians, who are perfectly happy to let the Athenians stay down where they are and leave them alone, get annoyed and attack. And basically, they don't destroy Athens, but they cripple it and knock down a lot of buildings and so on. And all the intellectuals, for instance, the Academy, which is, I think, founded by Plato, and certainly Aristotle was part of this, the Academy breaks up. And one of the places it goes is Tarsus. So Tarsus, as in the Acts of the Apostles, Luke has, I think, Paul say, but again it's Luke saying it, has Paul speak of Tarsus as no mean city. His kind of humble version of this is pretty hot stuff. And Tarsus probably was a college town. A college city. It was a Roman city, so it has stature. And Paul grows up, is a Jewish kid, and he has a sister, which we know from late in Luke's account in Acts. It's Luke's sister who sends her son, who's Paul's nephew, to save Paul's skin when he's in Jerusalem and in prison. And they get him out of town under the cover of darkness and 200 horsemen. They take him down to Caesarea Philippi. In any event, Paul gets out of town. He never mentions his sister at all. Typical boys, anyway. I had 3 sisters, I always mention them. Anyway, where would I be without my sisters? But in any event, Paul grows up in Tarsus. We don't know. He doesn't tell us anything of his family life, etc. We can infer from his letters that the education he received in Tarsus was first rate. He got a very good education. His rhetorical style reflects Greek argument style. Who do you think you are? And then posing opposites and this and that. We'll see some of this in terms of some of the ways he poses things and the questions that he asks. Do you think I am? And do you think I am? And so these are typical Hellenistic models of presentation. I Paul learned this very well. He also got a very good Jewish education. And he decided to eventually leave Tarsus and go to Jerusalem. He goes to Jerusalem, and it's hard to know when he gets there. But it's inferred because of the silence, which is not a very good argument. It inferred that it had to be probably sometime after 30 AD. Paul may have been born somewhere between 5 and 10 AD. So he's about 20 to 25 or 27 when he gets to Jerusalem. And the reason that is said is that Paul did not know Jesus. He makes no reference to Jesus in the flesh. In fact, he makes no reference in his letters to Jesus, just the name. The name that Paul uses is always Christ Jesus, or Jesus Christ, or some combination thereof. He did not know Jesus at all. Didn't know what Jesus, we have no indication from his early lifetime that he knew anything about Jesus. But he comes to study with Gamaliel. And Gamaliel does make an appearance in the Acts of the Apostles. We just read it the other day, where John and Peter are released, are in prison, and the Sanhedrin is ready to, whip them or rod them or whatever they're going to do. And Gamaliel, who's a member of the Sanhedrin, steps in and says, "My dear friends, have nothing to do with these two people. If what they are about comes from human sources, we have plenty of examples in our life, in our own lifetime, of charismatic figures who jumped up and made the headlines for a couple of days, but then petered away. They died, or they broke up, or became blather, and nobody paid attention." He says, let it go. If it's of human origin, it will collapse of its own weight. If, however, it is of God, then we cannot be seen to be fighting God.
Yep.
So he says, release them. And they do. And they do. So Gamaliel is much different than Caiaphas, who says, in effect, at the time when Jesus heals Lazarus, they all gather, and Gamaliel says, well, it's better for one to die than everybody else. It's a little bit different calculation this time. Gamaliel is if I can get this straight, is the descendant of the great Hillel, who is the great rabbinic scholar. And Hillel is paralleled by, forget his name now, I want to say Shammai. Shammai is a much stricter interpreter of the law. Hillel is a much more open kind of interpreter. And Gamaliel follows the Hillel tradition. Now it's intriguing that Paul comes to Jerusalem to study with Gamaliel, because, as Paul will speak of himself, as a Pharisee from birth, as a zealot, as someone blameless before the Lord. Imagine that. He's bold as brass. And so why does he want to study with this, for want of a better word, this great liberal? Well, just think of Ted Cruz going to the den of iniquity called Harvard in order to take on the Lawrence tribes and all of that crowd. And that's probably something of what Paul was doing, that he was the smart boy from Tarsus coming to the big city, to the big university, rabbinic school, and he's going to take them on, which probably he did. And he speaks of himself as a zealot, and that should be taken with great, it's just not a description that he was a fairly passionate fellow. This was a super patriot, super passionate guy. So passionate that he later goes on to say that I persecuted the Christians. So this is something of a background to Paul. We come to the moment that he describes as his great experience on the road to Damascus. Now, it's described at least 3 times in the Acts of the Apostles. Sometimes there's light, sometimes there's not. Sometimes there are people with Paul, sometimes, I don't know if they're always with him. Once he's on a horse, once he's on a donkey, I'm not sure what all of this. But the general experience is that he has this sense of overwhelming light. He falls to the ground, he's blinded. He's on a crusade to pick up, he's a bounty hunter. He's going to pick up Jewish Christians in Damascus and bring them back to the pokey in Jerusalem. And he's done this before, and he's going to continue doing this. And the road to Damascus, there's something called the Damascus Gate. It points directly to Damascus. It's the north end of the city of Israel. And Paul goes out. Yes?
Well, no, I've been there. I mean, I know I've seen the Damascus Gate
Yes,
in
yes,
Jerusalem.
yes.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, it's right there. So anyway, and it's still open, and we can go right up that way. Any event, Paul has this experience where he falls off the horse or whatever, the light blinds him, and then Saul, nice Jewish boy, why do you persecute me? I think this is relatively consistent in all 3 translations, all 3 events. Why do you these are very important words. Why do you persecute me? Who are you? Says Saul from the ground, blinded. I am Jesus the Nazarene, whom you persecute. In at least one of the versions, Paul is instructed to get up and somehow or other get to Damascus to meet a certain Ananias, who is a member of the Christian way, who will baptize him. He goes to Damascus. He waits a few days, blinded, etc. You can imagine the tension of all of that. Finally, Ananias comes. Ananias, who doesn't know visibly who this fellow is, but knows of him. He's, I would say famous, but he's infamous, perhaps. People want to stay away from this guy. He's poison. Certainly the Christians want to stay, or the Jewish Christians want to stay away from him. But the Lord says, go, Ananias, to the certain house on the street called Straight, and I think it's still there in Damascus, the Straight Street. And go there, and you will find Saul in prayer, and you are to baptize him. And Ananias goes, baptizes him, the scales from his eyes fall off, he sees, and this is the pivotal moment in Paul's life. And I would argue that questioning, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? See if you want to just take it literally. Why do you persecute me? What do you mean, persecute you? You beat the rap, so to speak. I mean, using my Bronx language here. You're raised from the dead. You're in heaven. How can I? There was a play once about boxing. My arms are too short to box with God. Wonderful imagery. But why do you persecute me? And Paul understands this as persecuting the Christians. that there is an intense identification between these Jewish Christians and the risen Lord. It's just not members of an organization. That there is a living, breathing, vital stuff in these Christians that is Jesus, the Christ. That organic sense of unity is the foundational principle of Paul's life. And we'll follow this in the letters and so on. When he talks, among other things, one of the interesting things about this moment is that, of course, Paul is baptized. As far as I know, none of the other apostles are baptized. They are Peter and James, John, and so on, all the Andrew and all the others, Thomas, doubting or otherwise. None of them are baptized. There's no reference to that at all. Paul is baptized. And this is the way that he is incorporated into the body of Christ. And that is not just kind of fanciful language, that is language that Paul can taste. And that is the core of his life for the rest of his life. So let me just take a quick tour on these, what happens afterwards with Paul. I've given you a table 5 here. This is from Ray Brown. And table 5 and 6. That I think I put them together on one page. I have it on 2. Which shows the conversion to Christ, the visit. By the way, just to maybe hit the pony one more time, not to kill it, but one of the things I would want to, maybe the only thing I want you to learn from this 3-week class is the conversion of Paul is not that he leaves being Jewish and becomes Christian. Paul would find that inconceivable. He remains a Jew throughout his life. And he sees no problem with this. Or he sees a problem, all kinds of problems that he's working on and working out. But that it is perfectly consistent for him to be Jewish and to be a follower of Jesus. After 70 AD, by excommunicate and all that other stuff, it becomes, and it's an extraneous thing. Somebody turns the chair around, all that. Then it becomes inconceivable to be Jewish and to be a Christian. And I met this year in Tantur in Israel. There were some extraordinary men and women, in some cases great theologians, great artists, extraordinary people who raised Jewish and then became Christian and Catholic. Some of them I have known. They're extraordinary people and a great gift to the church. Enormously gifted people. But Paul didn't see himself moving from one group to another. He saw himself as holding it all together. After this conversion experience where Paul now becomes a follower of Jesus, he leaves Damascus and he may go to Tarsus, but eventually he goes out into, quote, Arabia. Now we think of Arabia as Saudi Arabia, down where all the oil wells are. Well, it's not there. And let me just point roughly where, at least a possibility of where Paul was. For a number of years, This just kind of silent times, like Jesus after 12. You don't hear any more about him, or whatever, from growing up till whatever. After the experience in Damascus, Paul, whatever time he spends in Tarsus, he eventually goes to Arabia, where he spends many years, and may have been in the place called Petra, which you can see right down at the bottom of the page. It's the larger lettering has Nabatea. Interestingly, Herod was a Nabatean. They're all redheads. Petra is a city that had its day at the time of Paul and before, and then ceased to really exist, although it still remains, the buildings are still there. If you remember, I'm giving you all kinds of scholarly references here, if you remember Harrison Ford, The Last Crusade, Indiana Jones, The Last Crusade, remember that one?
Yeah.
Where they're going between the narrow,
Yeah.
that's Petra.
Ah,
Yeah.
That's where it is, and I was there. Were you there? Did you go?
No, one place I didn't get to.
Oh, it's an extraordinary
It's
place.
on my bucket list.
Oh yeah, we'll get
I wanna-
there someday.
I want to go to Petra, yeah.
Petra, it's a remarkable place. Anyway, I didn't go again this time, but because I've been there once, I didn't feel like going. I don't like deserts too much. But Paul spent a lot of time out there, and then eventually it goes back to Tarsus, where he remains until certain events transpire. We hear in Acts. Now, is this chronological? And it's tricky here, but at least it's important maybe to point this out. Peter has an experience on the coast of Joppa, right by Caesarea, where he's sitting on the roof and he has a dream of all these animals, many of which are unclean by Jewish law, coming down towards him in a big blanket. He's a very wonderful dreamer, Peter. And the voice of the Lord says, eat. And he says, I'm kosher, I can't eat this stuff. And the voice comes, eat, 3 times. And then departs. And then fairly quickly, he's invited to the house of a Roman centurion, a Gentile by the name of Cornelius. He's invited there, and he's a little bit hesitant about going because he's Jewish and we don't associate with Gentiles. And he goes into the house of Cornelius. He witnesses their faith. He proclaims the good news of Jesus, and he baptizes Cornelius and the whole household. And the whole household becomes a mysterious issue about children's baptism and so on and so forth. We're not going to spend a lot of time on that, but it's an ongoing issue, particularly with some Protestant traditions, of course. And any event, now, Antioch is the 3rd city of the Roman Empire. About the 3rd century AD, Antioch is destroyed by an earthquake. There's hardly anything left of it. But at this particular point, it's a pretty highfalutin town. The other 2 cities of the Roman Empire are not Athens, which is pretty, after Athens made this stupid move, and the Thracians wiped them out. The Antioch, Alexandria, and Rome are the great cities. And Antioch is one of the great cities, a great cosmopolitan area. Paul comes to this area, and they tell him the story of the Gentiles being converted by Peter. And what happens fairly quickly is that Paul begins a missionary journey with, oh heavens, who's with him? Begins with a C, I can't remember his last name. Anyway, and John Mark is with him too, interesting. John Mark's Gospel. He leaves from Antioch and he goes out, we see this first mission, it goes out to Cyprus, around Cyprus to Asia Minor, and then goes through Perga and up into Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe, and then comes back around and comes back to Antioch, where he tells with Barnabas and tells the story. John Mark got as far as Cyprus and then got afraid and ran away. And Paul wanted nothing more to do with him. You know, these sunshine soldiers, he went, get away from me. And so he goes back to Antioch, and Antioch, Luke tells us, is the first place that this new community is called Christians. And from Antioch, he then goes down to Jerusalem for the Great Council, and where people are saying, what are you doing, Paul? You're out in Asia Minor and you're welcoming Gentiles? And then you're not circumcising them? They're not obeying the dietary kosher rules? What are you doing? And Paul explains his ministry along with Barnabas. And Peter and even James backs him up to the point at which Paul is invited to continue doing his great work. And that is the beginning of his great work. The next great mission of Paul leads him it goes from Jerusalem to Antioch, returning to all those churches, and then finally he breaks out and goes across the Troas, which is on the western coast, if you will, of Turkey and Asia. That place up above Ankara is present-day Ankara, which is the capital of Turkey. He goes to Troas, and from Troas, an angel in the Acts of the Apostles invites him to come over to Europe. Karl Rahner, the great Catholic theologian of the 20th century, speaks about what he calls the 7 ages of Christianity. And he speaks about this moment when Paul goes over into Europe as the beginning of the 2nd age of Christianity. The first age is the age of Israel, of Palestine, the fishermen, etc. Now it's the age of Europe, of Greece, of Hellenistic culture, and so on. Remember in other times, Jews were conflicted about how are they to be involved with the Hellenistic world. They perceive it, particularly going back to the time of Alexander the Great coming into Palestine, they perceive any cooperation with the Hellenists, learning Greek, they all learn Greek eventually, but Greek customs and so on and so forth, they see this all as compromising of Judaism. And so they avoid it. And so you have groups, for instance, the Essenes, who go off into the desert because they want nothing to do with these terrible Greeks. And the terrible Jews who are making nice with the Greeks or whatever. And then later on with the Romans. So they see all making nice, so to speak, as compromise and disaster. Well, here's Paul going into the Hellenistic world and preaching the gospel. And this is the beginning of the new age of Christianity. And then he circles through. He goes from Philippi, the first place he goes. That you can see. We have to end. You can see. There's this dotted line from east to west, or west to east, if you will, from Byzantium on the east, all the way over to Dikaki, I can't even say it, Apollonia, that passes through Neapolis, Philippi, Thessalonica, and all the way across the Ignatian Way. It's one of these great Roman roads. One might argue that the Christian mission is enabled by the engineering skills of the Romans. That commerce and people can move back and forth fairly easily on this road. And Paul goes from, he lands at Neapolis, he stays at Philippi, which is a new Roman town. Philippi, of course, is the place where I remember correctly, is the place where the great battle with Mark Antony is finally settled, and the Romans win, and Axiom is over a little bit further on the coast. I'll find it. Oh, Axiom is way over. Axiom is where Brutus is defeated by the forces of Mark Antony and Octavian. And then finally at Philippi, Octavian defeats Mark Antony. Philippi becomes a Roman town, and it's the retirement center for a lot of Roman soldiers. And Paul goes to Philippi, first of all, spends a short time there, then goes on to Thessalonica, spends a short time there, and then comes down to Athens, and then to Corinth, where he spends a year and a half, interestingly enough, kind of camps out. And then he returns eventually back to Caesarea Maritime, and then quickly begins the next journey. Would Paul understand that he's in different missions? No, he doesn't. Third, second, or whatever. And he repeats, and you can see the mission again. The incredible, don't forget this guy is walking this mostly. And however safe the road may be, the Ignatian Highway, there are lots of other places that aren't safe, and Paul talks about being besieged and beaten and so on and so forth, and shipwrecks and all of that sort of thing. And he will spend, on this third journey, he will spend about 3 years in Ephesus. So this is mostly the whole of the 50s. About 8 or 10 years on these two missionary journeys, and he prides himself in caring for himself by making tents. He doesn't depend on people's generosity to support him in the mission. He pays for his own way, and he returns. Finally, he goes back to Jerusalem at the end of the third mission, where he runs into theological problems around the resurrection, where they're going to kill him until his nephew comes and saves his skin. And then they put him in prison in Caesarea Maritime, and he asks the council there, first Felix and later Festus, or maybe it's the opposite, I forget. He says to both of them, I am a Roman citizen. I have a right to a trial before the emperor. And Festus finally says, it's to the emperor you will go. So eventually, after 2 years in prison, he goes off to Rome, where the Acts of the Apostles ends. It's a kind of, isn't there more? Did you just run out of words or run out of ink or whatever? It just kind of ends. And what does Paul do after he gets to Rome? It's argued that there is some extraneous, because he does intend, he says, to go on to Spain. This guy's vision is incredible. I mean, he's got, and again, it's not, first class passage on the cruise lines. I mean, he's going to get to Spain. Now, did he get to Spain? We don't know. There is later, a century and a half later, there is some suggestion that he did. The legend is that Paul dies in Rome towards the end of Nero's reign, and that most of the pictures of Paul show him with a sword in his hand. It doesn't mean that he was a great swordsman. This is the means of his death. And many of the icons of the saints, particularly martyrs, Sebastian with arrows, etc., they will demonstrate in some way how they died. He's buried, was buried on the Appian Way. The bones were transferred at some point and later returned. And Peter and Paul are both buried in Rome, or that is the historical legend, it may be true. And the last thing I was saying is that when bishops go to make their ad limina visit to the Vatican, the ad limina means going to the gates of the tombs. Whether they actually do go visit the graves of Peter and Paul, I don't know. But that is the intent of it. And that this was indeed one of the early elements in the rising of Rome as the primal see of Christianity. That this, after all, is where the saints were buried, and particularly Peter and Paul, who are the twin pillars of the foundation of Christianity. Okay?
Peter's buried underneath the cathedral.
Underneath the basilica, there's some evidence for that.
What about Paul?
Well, there's the church of St. Paul outside the walls, and there is a claim made that that's where he is now buried. And it's on, you can get to it by subway. Outside the walls doesn't mean it's a long way. The old ancient walls in Rome. So it's fairly close. What I would ask you to do, next week what we'll do is we'll look at some of the letters of Paul. I'd ask you, everybody, this is not too arduous, I hope. I ask you all to read Philemon. Philemon is 335 words. So you can read it standing, chopping an onion. And then if you would read Philippians and Thessalonians and Galatians. Now you don't have to read all of them. Maybe just read one of the others if you can.
Okay, what did you say after, I have always pronounced it Philemon. So
Oh, I say Philemon.
okay, so what did you say after that?
Philemon, Philippians,
Yeah.
Galatians, and Thessalonians. Thessalonians is the first letter of Paul.
Just the first, not the second?
No, just the first. We're only going to read the first letter.
That's okay.
You don't have to read all of them. Read Philemon, which is 330 words,
Okay.
and then read maybe one of the others. So look at them just to get a feel for the kind of where they are in the Bible and so on and so forth. And you don't have to memorize the arguments or anything else. We'll look at them next week, okay? So and we'll get into Paul in terms of who Paul says he really is. Okay? Great, we're done.
Thank you.
Thank you. 10 minutes late.